Welcome to this May 24th, 2025 meeting of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. If you're not familiar with us, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're 100% run by volunteers, and we were founded about 30 years ago. So today, our speaker is attorney Tim Hale. He's a partner at Nye Sterling Hale Miller and Sweet, and he's going to be talking about institutional cover-ups of childhood sexual abuse in Santa Barbara County and beyond. And I always like to try to connect this back to why would a humanist society be interested in this topic? Why would Humanist Society of Santa Barbara be interested in hearing about this? Well, of course, we were all children and we all know children. And for many humanists, we tend not to be very religious, if at all. We tend to think that this is our only life, and we want it to be the best it can be for all people. We want to alleviate suffering in the world. One of the principles that Paul Kurtz, who wrote a document called The Affirmations of Humanism, said, we're committed to the application of reason and science to the understanding of the universe and solving of human problems. So childhood sexual abuse and cover-up by institutions is a human problem. So we're interested. What's happening? Why is it happening? How long has it been happening? What is the impact? And how are we as a society addressing the damage that's been done and preventing future harm? I noted that that movie Spotlight, which made the general public to a great extent aware of the issues with the Catholic Church and the institutional cover-ups, it's been 10 years since that movie came out. Here we are at 10-year anniversary. And I noticed in the Independent 2 weeks ago, there's 2 articles talking about sexual abuse of children associated with either a paraeducator, a youth pastor, part-time football coach, still here in our community. So it seemed like a very topical and appropriate to talk about it at this time. So who is Tim? So happy and pleased to have you here. 25 years he's been successfully representing the survivors of childhood sexual abuse. He's considered a national expert in institutional child sex abuse litigation. He battles for transparency against institutions that have covered up childhood sexual abuse committed by their members. These include the Catholic Church, the LDS or Mormon Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Boy Scouts of America, private and public schools, and residential treatment centers and programs designed to support at-risk youth and youth with developmental disorders. He's recognized as an expert on childhood sexual abuse in these institutional settings. So with that, I welcome you, Tim, and thank you so much for being willing to speak to our group today.
Thanks, Judy. And I really appreciate everyone being here and listening to what I have to say. I should say up front that I was never one of those kids that liked to raise their hand in class and speak. And the idea of participating in the Socratic method in law school terrified me. But, my very first abuse case involved the Franciscan friars at the seminary in the old mission. And it became terrifyingly quickly apparent how important secrecy was to the perpetrators and to the institution that was covering up and concealing their crimes, and how dangerous secrecy was for children exposed to such men. And because of that, every opportunity I've gotten since then to flap my gums about these crimes, I do, because nowhere is it more true than in this context that knowledge is power, and the more people that are aware not only of the men that specifically pose a risk, but also what institutions can be trusted to prioritize the safety of children ahead of the reputation of an organization. It just makes it so important to talk about these types of things. So I hope that when this is over today, that you will, if you've learned anything from it or taken anything from it, share it with others, talk about it with others. Communication is key to making today's kids safer, and also really to bring peace to today's survivors, who oftentimes, as crazy as it sounds, are thinking that somehow they're the only ones that the abuse took place was somehow their fault. And hearing these types of conversations can really, even if they don't acknowledge what happened to them, still bring them some peace and help them process what they've been through. So, with that being said, we now take cases across the country. I have cases from Santa Barbara all the way to New York, but today we're going to focus on Santa Barbara, which is very near and dear to my heart because this is my hometown. This is where I grew up. I grew up with a picture of the mission on the wall that had been painted by my grandmother in her home. And even though I was not raised Catholic, I'd always viewed it as something of a holy, a special place. Little did I know the horrific nature of crimes that were being committed there throughout my childhood, both before and after. So let's start today with, based on the work we've done so far at my firm, what we know about the history there. And in that regard, the seminary had been there for a long time before I started working on these cases in 1999. Through our investigation, the first perpetrator we identified in Santa Barbara was a Franciscan father named Father Owen de Silva. He committed crimes against children, seminarians, in the 1930s. I have no doubt that there were earlier victims. I shudder to think of the horrors that the indigenous people suffered when the Franciscans were coming in and building these missions. But the list that we have put together is based on people that I have interviewed, I have spoken with, and I was fortunate enough to meet with one of the victims of Father De Silva, and he shared with me his experience in the 30s and also shared with me what another victim had told him about his experience with Father De Silva. So I am confident that Father De Silva is the first known identified perpetrator in Santa Barbara County, and he was a Franciscan friar just up the street from where I'm at the mission and at the seminary. Now, we haven't identified any other perpetrators since Father De Silva until the 1960s, but in the 1960s, there was a huge, really terrifying jump in reports of abuse. And I think it dates back to a letter that I'm going to try and share with you from the Bishop of San Diego to another priest who was stationed in Rome at the time. And what it suggests is that the Franciscans had been, for whatever reason, granted permission to run two outlying parishes in the Diocese of San Diego. And apparently, they had been using those two outlier parishes to send their problem priests. And eventually, it got to the point where it was so bad that the Bishop of San Diego decided he had had enough. And he actually wrote this priest from the Diocese of San Diego, who was stationed in Rome, asking him for canonical help to help get the Franciscans out of the Diocese of San Diego because they didn't want any more Franciscan problem priests abusing the parishioners in the diocese. And so I'm going to try and share this letter with you right now. Let's see how it goes. So this is a letter, and I'll scroll down from the Bishop of San Diego to Father James Booth, who, interestingly enough, was later himself revealed to be a perpetrator in litigation we had with the Diocese of San Diego. But that's not the point of what I want to share with you. What I want to share with you is what I've highlighted farther down in the letter, which is where the bishop makes as clear as a Roman Catholic bishop will make clear about the misconduct of priests. And it's now actually 26 years of litigating clergy abuse cases. It's become very, very obvious that Catholic hierarchy does not like to refer expressly to crimes against children as what they are, and they'll use code language. Oftentimes, they'll talk in terms of a priest having a problem with alcoholism without specifically saying there's a problem with children. The language I've highlighted here, frankly, is about as expressed an acknowledgement by a member of the Catholic hierarchy that I've seen. And what the bishop wrote was that during the 13 years since this diocese was erected, to my own personal knowledge, the Santa Barbara province of the Franciscan Fathers, and that is our Franciscans who operate the mission and formerly the seminary, has used this diocese as a dumping ground for their moral, mental, and physical problems. That is about as clear a sign as you're going to get from a Catholic hierarchy member about the childhood sexual abuse being committed by their priests. The bishop went on to say, it became necessary for me some time ago to demand the withdrawal of one misfit after another. So clearly the bishop is fed up with the Franciscans dumping their problem priests in San Diego, and he's asking for help from this lawyer in Rome. And he writes, "Will you kindly advise me regarding a canonist in Rome who, through experience and other qualities, would be the best to represent me in petitioning the congregation to set aside the beneplacitum and restore the two parishes of Banning and Beaumont to the diocese for the good of religion." He wants the Franciscans out of those two parishes where they were dumping problem priests and out of the Diocese of San Diego. For the good of the Diocese of San Diego, he succeeded. Unfortunately, it was not good for Santa Barbara, because it's clear to me that after this letter was written and after he went through the process of expelling the Franciscans from San Diego, all hell broke loose in Santa Barbara, and the Franciscans began sending their problem priest to Santa Barbara. And the end result of that was an influx into the seminary and into the old mission Santa Barbara that resulted in numerous perpetrators in authority positions living with teenage boys from Catholic families who had taught them to see priests as the voice of God. It was just an absolutely horrific circumstance. And through it, the Franciscans created, or more than likely strengthened, what was really a culture of hidden sexual abuse. And the results were absolutely, absolutely tragic. So the scandal in Santa Barbara, the worst of it, spans from the early 1960s into the early 1990s. One of the most notorious and violent sexual predators at the start of the scandal was a gentleman named Father Mario Cimarusti. He occupied the position of prefect of discipline at the seminary. He beat and violently sexually abused at least 27 seminary boys in the 60s into the early 70s. And those are folks that we have identified, that I've spoken to, or that I've seen the depositions taken of. I think it's safe to say that when you look at the numbers of people we've identified, and by identified, again, I mean that somebody I've actually spoken to and confirmed what they had to say, you can probably take that number and at least triple it in terms of the actual number of victims out there, because most survivors never talk about what their experiences were and are able to come forward. Cimarusti was just on a rampage, exploiting his position of power as the prefect of discipline at the seminary through all the 60s into the early 70s, until finally it got to the point where so many kids were complaining and raising reports about him that they had to ship him out of Santa Barbara. They sent him, in fact, they got him out, not only out of Santa Barbara, they sent him out of the state, which is a good sign of how bad things were. They sent him to Guaymas, Mexico, where, no surprise, he would eventually be forced to leave again due to further allegations. There are other perpetrators that were very active at the seminary in the 1960s, but Cimarusti is by far the worst, both in terms of the number of victims identified and also in the violence and intensity of his sexual assaults. Now, even with Cimarusti gone, unfortunately, a new wave of perpetrators came into the seminary and the old mission in the 1970s. And in fact, one of the seminary victims from the 1960s had graduated from the seminary and went on to become the most prolific Franciscan perpetrator that I know of, Father Robert Van Handel. He abused seminarians. He came back to the seminary he attended and that he was abused at, and he abused seminarians from the 1970s into the 1990s, when the seminary finally shut down because the scandal was just too toxic that the Franciscans couldn't allow it to continue there any longer. During Van Handel's crime spree, when seminarians were no longer enough for him, he created a boys' choir that he ran at the seminary and at the mission. He created it for younger boys, and so he gained access to younger victims. The horrifying thing is that before his period of abuse began, he actually warned the Franciscans when he was a young priest about his attraction to young boys. The Franciscans ignored that warning, allowed him to become a priest, gave him access to seminarians, allowed him to form a boys' choir that they considered part of his ministry. And as awful as that is, that was not the last time that Franciscans received word about the risk he posed to kids and didn't do anything about it. Some of you may be familiar with the deceased Father Virgil Cordano, who is really kind of a legendary figure here in Santa Barbara. And that always, after speaking with the father of a number of my other clients, really bothered me because in 1989, the father of two choir boys who I represented and who were abused by Father Van Handel actually complained about their abuse to Father Cordano. Nothing happened, and Van Handel was able to continue to abuse boys at the seminary and at the mission up until 1992. So Cordano had an opportunity to put a stop to the abuse by Van Handel, and he did not either. And in fact, when the new round of lawsuits began in 2002 and 2003, many of them involving Van Handel, Cordano made public statements about his supposed surprise at the allegations against Father Van Handel and other Franciscans. And the father of those two boys bravely came forward and testified a few years later about what he informed Father Cordano. For whatever reason, Cordano still occupies a legendary status here in Santa Barbara, but I know that that deceased father did not look at him in that light, and for very good reason. With that background in mind, to date, we have identified 28 victims of Father Van Handel. And again, identified means we've heard them talk, we've spoken with them personally, we've heard them testify. Without a doubt, you can take that number and easily triple it because he had access to so many boys at the seminary, in the boys' choir, and most just are not able to talk about it. I'm sure there are many out there who fell victim to him as well, who just have not come forward. Not only did he abuse members of the choir, he would pass members of the choir off to a pedophile friend of his from England. So when he would take the choir on trips to Europe, he would hand boys off to this pedophile who was not a Franciscan, but was friends with Van Handel. Or if that man came to Santa Barbara, the same thing would happen here. It was just a really tragic and horrific circumstance that should have been shut down by the Franciscans before Van Handel became a priest in the 1970s. Even when the seminary closed, the Franciscans continued to send perpetrators to the property where the mission was because that was a significant residential home for Franciscans, that is the mission. So even with the seminary no longer completely under their control, the mission was still home base for a number of men who we found out over and over again had accusations against them and who the Franciscans were depositing there without warning anyone in the community. At last count, since the 1960s, the Franciscans have assigned at least 38 predatory priests and religious brothers to that 2 square mile radius of land on which the seminary was and the mission still is located. The numbers we have identified of victims of those 38 predatory priests so far is 80 Santa Barbara children. Again, I'm sadly confident you can triple that number at the very least, and I'm sure that's how many victims in Santa Barbara there were, if not many more. I've never had a situation where a perpetrator simply abused once or twice. So given that there were 38 predatory priests assigned here, like I said, I'm sure the number is far more than the 80 we've actually identified and spoken with. That being said, although they certainly were the primary, the Franciscans were not the only offenders in the county in terms of Catholic entities that were sending perpetrators here. There were priests from other religious orders, such as Jesuit Father Stephen Special, who was at Our Lady of Sorrows. He also abused children here. There were many predators who were priests from the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. It's safe to say that from St. Joseph's Parish in Carpinteria to the missions in Santa Ynez and Lompoc, all the way up to St. Mary's Church in Santa Maria, every church in Santa Barbara County has had at least one predator assigned or in residence or doing supply work, which means they're coming in and performing their ministry at each parish or church in Santa Barbara County. And most of those churches have had multiple such men over the years with countless victims in Santa Barbara. So keeping in mind those numbers I just gave you, those were 38 Franciscan predatory priests. Those were 80 victims of Franciscan predators. I haven't given you the full numbers yet for the other non-Franciscan clergy perpetrators in Santa Barbara. One of the most notorious archdiocese priests, Father Matthew Kelly, he was stationed primarily at Our Lady of Guadalupe on the east side of Santa Barbara, just off of Milpas Street. He did do some work at Holy Cross up on the Mesa, but his home base was Our Lady of Guadalupe, where he preyed almost exclusively on young Hispanic boys from the 1950s into the 1970s was when he was finally chased out of town by angry parishioners with the help of a man who eventually left the priesthood. He was at the time Father Michael Burrell, and he actually went to the Archbishop Manning about what he saw Father Kelly was doing with young boys, bringing them into the parish, bringing them into the rectory, taking him to his room, and most horrifyingly, Father Kelly had a cabin in the San Ynez Mountains, and it was common knowledge that he was taking young boys from the east side there on weekends for overnight trips. And this practice of his continued for decades until he was finally forced out by the parishioners and then Father Burrell. And it also helped that his neighbors at that cabin in the San Ynez Mountains inadvertently came across child pornography in his mail after a rainy day caused his mail to split open. We have identified at least 11 of Father Kelly's victims to date. When his cabin was sold after his death, the buyer found a trunk of photos of naked boys he had taken with the camera that Father Kelly had actually used, and he turned them over to us as evidence to support our cases. So that there is absolutely zero question about who this priest was and what his proclivities were. There were many others. Father Romer is one of the more notorious ones. He was at St. Raphael's, San Roque. Like I said, most of the parishes and churches here in town had multiple perpetrators. As a result, we have identified 64 total predatory priests and brothers that were assigned in Santa Barbara County since we began tracking these numbers, and we've identified 107 of their victims. Again, I think you can take that number and triple it, sadly. The bottom line is, I think on a per capita basis of the population of Santa Barbara, I don't believe even the cities where the clergy abuse scandal has hit the hardest, or at least gotten the most publicity, such as Boston or Los Angeles, I don't think any of them can compare to Santa Barbara. And I think that's thanks in large part to the Franciscans sending so many of their predator priests here without any warning to the community. I just don't think there's an entity out there that will touch what the Franciscans did to this county, or frankly anywhere else. The volume to that small 2 square mile radius piece of property of predators there, we'll never know the complete story in terms of how many children fell victim as a result of what the Franciscans did when they were evicted from San Diego, basically. Unfortunately, the abuse in Santa Barbara did not stop with the Catholic Church. It also included the Boy Scouts of America. And at least in terms of the level of sophistication of an institution in covering up and concealing these types of crimes, I think Boy Scouts of America actually would give the Catholic Church a run for its money. Scouting first became aware of sexual predators taking leadership positions to gain access to scouts over a century ago, if you can believe that. I was a scout myself. Thankfully, nothing that I recall happened to me. But in looking back, you can see how easy it was for predatory leaders to gain access to scouts. And it was so easy and so prevalent that a century ago, Boy Scouts began documenting men who had been accused, and they created what they first called red flag files. Eventually, they were named other things, perpetrator files, a number of different names over the years. But what they did not do was they didn't report these men to law enforcement. And in fact, they really aggressively and proactively instructed their volunteers and parents in writing to report abuse allegations internally. And at the same time that they were giving these instructions to keep reports of abuse internally, they were giving instructions that really were designed to scare parents and volunteers from making a report to law enforcement by warning parents and volunteers that if they did make such a report, they might be sued for defamation, and that the only way to be safe about making such a report was to report to a scout executive and keeping it internal to the organization. And scouting actually maintained and really aggressively put that policy into action in writing for many, many decades, and actually didn't change it in its written materials until my office made those written instructions and those written warnings about defamation as part of the liability basis for one of our Boy Scout lawsuits in the early 2010s. And so until they were held accountable for it and realized they were facing liability, Only then did they finally start to change their written policies and say, oh, okay. And they backed off the fear mongering and trying to get people not to report to law enforcement. The first case of scout leader abuse that we've documented in the county was actually in Goleta in 1972. I will say that our documentation and our tracing of the number of victims within the county has not been as detailed, as extensive. I don't know the exact numbers. I feel fairly confident about our numbers regarding the clergy abuse cases. With scouting, we know the earliest one so far was in 72. I have no doubt there were some that were earlier than that, but the first one we've identified is 72. The most recent was in 2008. That case actually went to trial in 2015. Both of those instances, the one in 72 and the one in 2008, for whatever reason, involved abuse and leaders located in Goleta, not in Santa Barbara proper. In the 2008 case that went to trial in 2015, our client's mother followed the written instructions of scouting, reported the abuse to the local scout executive, and then asked him if he was going to make a report to law enforcement and whether she should. And the scout executive actively and aggressively discouraged her from reporting the abuse to law enforcement, followed company policy, and told her that scouting would handle it internally. And that came out during the trial in 2015, and ultimately, I think, played a significant role in the matter being settled before the jury got a hold of it. So I think scouting and the Catholic Church have definitely taken things to an advanced and higher level when it comes to covering up and concealing these types of crimes that is I haven't seen too often. But that said, while they have been the main focus of our lawsuits here in Santa Barbara, they are far from the only ones that have covered up and concealed child sexual abuse by their leaders. We've worked on claims by survivors of abuse by the Mormon Church, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Methodist Church, various Christian denominations. Last year, we settled an abuse claim involving the Adventist Church. A little bit before that, we litigated 3 claims against the Presbyterian Church in Carpinteria. That litigation went on for 8 years, finally concluding in 2022. It involved abuse by a church leader committed in 2013, so relatively recent abuse. And in the process of litigating that case, we discovered, not surprisingly, more cover-ups and the transferring of another local Presbyterian predator from the Santa Barbara churches down to Presbyterian churches in Ventura, where he abused again, only to be transferred by the Presbyterian hierarchy again, this time to the Midwest and to the East Coast. It's very clear from these cases that there is a deeply ingrained culture of hiding and covering up childhood sexual abuse. One of the reasons we found out about the cover up in Carpinteria was because the Santa Barbara District Attorney's Office, one of the DAs there, Paula Waldman, did a really fabulous job of not just focusing on making sure the perpetrator was prosecuted, but also investigating the conduct by the church leaders who received reports of misconduct by that perpetrator. And one church leader in particular, the pastor out there, gave a recorded interview before the civil lawsuit ever started. And I think Paula caught him unawares. He was so focused on the idea that he was offering evidence or testifying in the criminal prosecution of the predator, he at least temporarily stopped thinking about the concealment and cover up committed by his church, and he was actually honest about it. And so Paula obtained recorded statements of him talking about the toxic nature of the policies of that Presbyterian church in Carpinteria in covering up and concealing those crimes. And fortunately, I was able to gain access to that video and was able to use that to cross-examine him at his deposition about policies he wanted to deny, about conduct he did not want to own. But because when he was questioned by Paula, he was thinking about the guilt of the perpetrator as opposed to the liability of the institution, he was honest. And the truth came out. And we were able to expose, thanks to that great work by the district attorney's office, what went on behind the scenes when they became aware of the risk that predator posed. And that's a really
Mhm.
great example of the way civil lawsuits and criminal matters can really work together with a synergy that not only results in the conviction and registration of the predator, but also makes people aware of the institutional conduct that enable the predator and put children at risk. Another unique situation, really kind of distinct from the typical structure of the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, and other Christian denominations, are the LDS cases, the Mormon cases. They present more of a unique challenge for civil lawsuits due to the structure of the church, because in the Mormon church, the members of the church also are leaders of the church. The Catholic Church presents really a bright line between its leaders and its parishioners, the priests wearing the white collar, and there's a very clear distinction and separation between the two. Whereas with the Mormon Church, it all blends together. It's all in the same neighborhood. And so in the LDS Church, the leaders are members, neighbors, family members, which creates a much, I think, stronger inclination to circle the wagons around the accused leader. And don't get me wrong, I've certainly seen Catholic parishioners protect predator priests. I never forget, even after Father Van Handel pled guilty to sexually abusing a number of choir boys, that there were people who testified in subsequent civil lawsuits who refused to believe that he was guilty of anything and refused to acknowledge that he had committed those crimes. So certainly Catholic parishioners are able and willing to circle the wagons, but because oftentimes in the LDS Church, the leaders who are accused of such crimes are, like I said, members of the church. They're your neighbors, they're your family members. It creates a much stronger inclination in church members to really circle the wagons and protect the accused, which makes such cases really, really challenging. We've had some. I've got one active one down in San Diego right now. There's been a few in Santa Barbara, but not many, just because I think for that reason it's much more challenging because of the structure of the church. And unfortunately, and somewhat surprisingly to me, secular organizations have engaged in similar conduct. We currently have a case pending against the Boys and Girls Club on the East Coast. We've had multiple cases over the years against various public schools from Santa Barbara to Santa Maria. We're actually set to go to trial here in Santa Barbara against a Montecito school district at the end of July. But that being said, while there's certainly public institutions are just as capable of covering up and concealing these types of crimes, I do think that the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts of America have brought a level of sophistication to covering up these types of crimes that few have been able to match. And it's really not that surprising because of how long they've been doing it for. Boy Scouts since the early 1900s, the Roman Catholic Church for far longer. Some of my colleagues have discovered documentation from the 1800s talking about how the church wanted crimes committed by church leaders against children to be handled, keep them secret, keep them quiet. This has been something that's been going on for a very, very long time. And, it's important to remember also that, for instance, in the Father Kelly cases, I obtained testimony from a priest who acknowledged that priests and other religious, such as nuns, are taught early in their training about something called the doctrine of mental reservation. And what the doctrine of mental reservation says, in a nutshell, is it's okay for that church leader to lie and to conceal if doing so is for the purpose of preserving the reputation of the church. Suffice it to say, that is an absolutely dangerous and deadly doctrine for children who are exposed to predatory church leaders. And yet, I can count on one hand how many times I've taken the deposition of church leaders and they have openly acknowledged being aware of the criminal conduct of their fellow priests and religious brothers, despite the fact that there has been testimony from lay witnesses, other survivors, other seminarians about having gone and reported to that specific priest the crimes committed by their brethren. They still will not acknowledge. I can guarantee you that that doctrine plays a critical role in why they feel okay to not reveal what they know about the criminal conduct of their brethren. And all of this leads to the final issue for this discussion, which is whether after years of litigation, these entities have changed the way they do business. And I think there's no doubt that they have learned to say the right things about how they conduct their business, about mandatory reports of suspected abuse, about maintaining too deep rules so that no child is supposedly ever allowed to be alone with an adult who is not a relative. But I also think that saying the right thing and doing the right thing for these institutions, they don't necessarily align. And unfortunately, secrecy is embedded so deeply in their DNA that, in my experience, more often than not, behind the scenes, it's still business as usual. We saw that in the Boy Scouts trial. They were saying the right things about reporting abuse to law enforcement, but their scout executive was telling my client's mother, don't go to the police. We'll take care of it internally. We've seen it with the Franciscans, and I've outlined this in some of our recent complaints, who have definitely learned to say the right things. And when they know a priest accused is going to be identified publicly, they will jump at the opportunity to do so themselves. But they have nevertheless recently allowed admitted Franciscan perpetrators to be in public ministry, or they've placed known unregistered perpetrators into residences without any warning to their neighbors. So again, saying the right things, absolutely. Doing the right things, I just have a hard time believing it. And for that reason, my focus in these cases is on publicizing as much information as possible in order to make the public aware. We fought for the release of personnel files of perpetrators, of depositions of Catholic hierarchy members who deny knowledge, and then at the same time fought for the release of the depositions of people who testified about reporting abuse to them. When I draft a lawsuit, I try to put as much detail into the lawsuit as I can, not necessarily about the specifics of the abuse, but particularly about the hierarchical conduct that enabled the perpetrators to commit these crimes, and especially the more recent such conduct. It's not as good as a criminal conviction. It's not as good as having someone have to register as a sex offender, but at least it gives the public some way to gather information about who can be trusted to prioritize the safety of their children over the reputation of an institution. And oftentimes, it's impossible for a district attorney to obtain a conviction in these cases because of the cover-ups, the criminal statute of limitations have expired. And so the only way to get this information out there is through these civil lawsuits and talking about these civil lawsuits. So thank the society for having this giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I thank all of you for listening today. I hope you will continue to talk about what you heard. Share this information with parents, with grandparents, with other child care custodians. And just remember, it usually isn't the scary guy in the shadows who is the danger to children. It's someone who you know and you trust and is often working for an institution that you hold in equally high regard. Thanks.
Thank you. Marion was asking, although you mentioned that you spent a lot of time talking about the Catholic Church as a particular issue, and this abuse does happen other places, secular places you mentioned.
Yes.
But she says, what do you think about like a priest vow of celibacy? Is the whole weirdness around the Catholic Church and sex and celibacy, do you think that's part of the problem? Do you think it would be less of a problem if priests were allowed to marry women or men?
I think it was a factor. I think it contributed to the problem. I don't think it would have eliminated the problem. What it probably did was draw some deviants to the church because they felt more comfortable in the setting, and maybe that's why in part the numbers have been higher with the Catholic Church. But I've also had too many cases to count where the perpetrator was affiliated with a church that allowed them to marry, or was affiliated with scouts and they had a family, a wife, kids of their own, and yet they're still abusing Boy Scouts, or they're still abusing, I mean, Father Van Handel himself, at the time that he was arrested, even though he was a Franciscan priest at the time, he acknowledged that he was dating an adult woman. So I think it's a factor. I don't think it's the only factor. And I think a big part of the reason why perpetrators are drawn to these institutions is because they know, particularly with something like the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts is there was this built-in protection for them to commit the crimes that they committed through the way church leaders, scout leaders were held in this high esteem and were trusted and would be ultimately, unfortunately, protected in order to protect the reputation of the institution.
There's a couple of us here on the call who have been doing volunteer work in prisons. And one of the things that I've learned from that and working with the people who are working on rehabilitation for themselves is not to ask the question, like, what is wrong with you, but instead say, what happened to you?
Yes.
And so it seems to me when you talk about some of this history that it could be that the abusers were themselves abused as children, and maybe that's a pattern through the ages in seminaries in particular. Just wondering if you had any thoughts about that, and what do you think is the appropriate punishment or rehabilitation so that we can stop the generational trauma?
It's without a doubt, it is a generational trauma. And as I mentioned earlier in the talk, Father Van Handel himself was abused by a different Franciscan perpetrator when he was a seminary, and he was repeating to his victims what was done to him. I should qualify that with saying there are many survivors out there who do not become perpetrators themselves, but there certainly is a ongoing, reoccurring trauma that occurs. I have no doubt. I think the vast majority of people who've been incarcerated for sexual crimes, for crimes of violence, for crimes of related to substance abuse and drug use, I think they are all were likely victims of some kind of trauma, most likely sexual trauma, but some kind of trauma for sure. I agree with your approach about, with the idea of asking them about what their experience was, but I will also say, and my opinion in this regard was formed from conversations I had with an expert that I worked with for a number of years, but I just don't believe rehabilitation is possible. Once someone acts on the urge to sexually abuse, once that Pandora's box is open, I don't know that you can close it and stop that. I think the key, and this is what the expert that I worked with told me, was the key is that when that urge is felt, before it's acted on, start treating it. Start treating the underlying trauma. And also for those even who haven't felt the urge, but who had that underlying trauma, it's so important to do the deep dive and really, really, as much as survivors don't want to, face what happened to them, work through what happened to them. That will prevent a lot of the acting out that unfortunately leads to these generational traumas. But I do think that once it's acted upon, I don't think it's fixable. I wish it was, but I've never had a case where it was just a single instance. Whoops, I made a mistake, and it's never been acted upon again. I don't think that's the way it works. In terms of
So you
how,
think then isolating them from children is the only course of action?
well, yes and no. I think the key is going to be we need to get to a place as a society where, and I don't want this to be a scarlet letter, but I think sex registrations are critical. Frankly, more critical than the incarceration part, because the reality is, I mean, I just had a client whose tennis coach was incarcerated for the second time, but he's going to get less than a year in prison, even though it's his second conviction. Terms for these types of crimes oftentimes are not long enough. So the important thing is giving the community tools to work with, and the best tool in that regard is being able to identify them through registration as a sex offender, who the predators are. And then we've got to get, I hope we can get to a place as a society where that doesn't result in vigilante justice and people going out and taking these folks out. We've got to be able to identify them. That's the way to make kids safer. We got to make sure that they should never be alone with a child. There's no island we can go and put them on. They're part of our communities. But I think talking about it, being aware of who they are and working with them in that way, helping them help themselves is the best we can do to deal with it. And hopefully, I don't think we're ever going to eliminate childhood sexual abuse, but hopefully, in continuing to go after these institutions who have enabled these types of crimes, we will force them to be more aggressive about reporting misconduct and that kind of thing, and we'll at least drive the numbers of victims down. Again, I don't think we'll eliminate it, but I hope we can reduce the numbers and reduce the likelihood of these crimes being repeated.
What drew you to this practice area? That's Tracy's question. And how much of your firm is involved with these kinds of cases, or do you do other things as well?
Yeah, we do other things as well, but every lawyer in this firm has worked on these types of cases. In fact, for instance, we're representing 330 Boy Scout victims in the current bankruptcy. That required an all hands on deck approach, and every lawyer, every paralegal, every secretary has been involved in working on abuse cases. And in terms of what drew me to these types of cases, it happened to me. So I understand what survivors have been through. I didn't go to law school with the intention of becoming a child sex abuse lawyer, but the first time I gained the opportunity to work on one of these cases, it just called to me, and I know that's why.
Thank you. On a somewhat related issue, Margaret is asking, Margaret is the president and founder of the Free Thought Society, and she says during her discrimination case against Boy Scouts of America, discovered that the names of known non-theists, people who don't believe in God, including herself, were found on a list of undesirables. Names appeared next to pedophiles, thieves, convicted felons, and she's wondering if that list is still in existence, since people who don't believe in God, non-theists, are still not allowed to join the Boy Scouts of America.
So in our litigation, we were able to obtain the secret files, the IV files from 1965 up until 2011. Those files focused only on the sexual predators. That said, I did hear of and learn of these other lists. I never actually got to see them. They were not part of the IV files, but I did hear about them. They just were not something that we were allowed to gain access to in the litigation because they weren't relevant to the facts that we needed to prove our
Mhm.
case. But I'm aware they're out there, and I'm sorry that that's outrageous that she was listed in any way with people with a predatory background. That's
Mhm.
offensive.
And just for my understanding, when you talk about criminal cases versus civil cases, do you just get involved with civil cases or do you get involved with criminal cases as well?
Well, I get involved with criminal cases to the extent that oftentimes, for instance, right now, I'm supporting a woman who was sexually assaulted here in Santa Barbara. She probably is not going to have a civil case, but I'm just supporting her through the criminal process, offering her guidance, giving her feedback on what she's hearing, that sort of thing. I can't be directly involved with the criminal cases because I'm not a district attorney, but it's not been unheard of for there to be concurrent civil and criminal cases. For instance, in the Boy Scout case that went to trial, our civil case was concurrent as that prosecution was happening. And there's also been times where we have provided the evidence we've developed to the district attorney in hopes of them prosecuting. For instance, after our first case in 99, we did a lot of investigation of the other Franciscan perpetrators. And in 2002, we turned over thousands of pages of investigative materials to the district attorney's office that the DA used to create arrest warrants, and a number of Franciscan perpetrators were arrested based on that evidence. Unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court issued an opinion shortly thereafter that rendered those prosecutions unconstitutional. But we certainly have tried to help the district attorney where we can.
And we recently had a new pope show up in the Catholic Church. Do you have any opinions on either the old pope or the new pope?
I think Francis and Leo both appear to be saying more socially liberal things, but they're part of an institution that, like I said earlier, I think the idea of concealing and covering up these crimes is so deeply embedded in its DNA and the way it's conducted its business. And I know there are discussion of regarding both men of themselves having been in positions of authority and received word of abuse committed by priests under them that I'm skeptical that it's going to make much, if any, of a difference. There are things they could do right now. They could turn over their secret files to law enforcement. They should turn them all over. That was one of the things we pressured the Boy Scouts to do. Take your ineligible volunteer files, turn them all over to every law enforcement agency in every county where these crimes took place. The Catholic Church could do that as well. The Catholic Church documents these types of crimes extensively. There is so much information they have. They should take every one of those files, go to every community where those crimes were committed, and turn them over to law enforcement, and that's not going to happen. it's a massive battle just to get them to turn over the most fundamental of documents in these cases.
Thank you. Thank you so much for talking with us and sharing this with us, your perspective and your history with this. I don't see any other questions here in the chat, and given us a lot to think about and encourage all of us to spread the word. So thank you, Tim.
Great. Thanks for having me. And like I said, I hope I will email you that document so that people can read about that history in Santa Barbara if they'd like to read that.
Yeah, we'll publish it in our newsletter and
Great.
put it on our YouTube channel. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks very much.
I want to thank you all for attending. If anyone feels inclined to make a donation to our organization, there's our PayPal QR code, or you can Zelle us, hssbpayments@gmail.com. We gratefully accept any donations, and of course, we like to keep these meetings free and open to the public. So thanks again for attending.